We're here at entry number 30, and this is for the week of May 18th. This is a fairly long one. This is 4 pages. Get us started and tell us how this entry begins, if you would.
Well, it covers an entire week, and early Monday morning in the week of May 18, I did report to Rankin about the present status of our work in the various areas, and we had been handicapped because some of the members of the staff were absent. Mr. Jenner was taking a deposition. Mr. Hubert was on military duty at the Pentagon. But I told Mr. Rankin that we basically were not going to have a draft report available by May 20, which was obviously the deadline that he had most recently set. And I told him it would be very unlikely that we would have a workable draft of the entire report for several weeks. So, and I identified the 3 areas of Area 3, which was the Jenner-Liebler area, Area 4, which was the Coleman-Slauson area, and Area 5, which was the Hubert-Griffin area, as being the areas that were the difficult areas. And of course, those were each very, very significant areas, and I suggested to Rankin that he have personal interviews with the lawyers involved and try to hear from them directly what the issues were, and also to encourage them to work harder or more productively, as only he could do in his polite but effective manner.
As we start getting into summer, it does seem like more and more of the staff members have obligations elsewhere.
Yes, that's true, of course, and as I mentioned earlier, I probably did say when I called them originally that I thought it might be done in 6 months, but I had no idea, and if I'd said 9 months, it might have discouraged some people, but it was unfair for me to criticize my colleagues who had commitments back with their firms or government agencies, as in Ireland's case, because in my case I was working for the Department of Justice, and if the work took 2 years, I was commissioned to see it to the end, so to speak. But I think people like Ireland Inspector and David Bellin, who did have to return to some of their other obligations in, if not May or early June, they were still available by phone and on occasion to come back to help with specific projects. But then the next thing dealt with in this memo was the fact that I did get a call from Bill Manchester, the author / historian, who had been asked by the Kennedy family to write the authoritative story of the assassination with the full cooperation of the family. And there had been, he was encouraged, probably by the Deputy Attorney General or the Attorney General's office, to come visit with the commission, and I was probably identified as someone that he could contact initially for that purpose. So I did spend some time with Mr. Manchester. I learned more about his work with the family, about the interview he took at some length of Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow. And that his project was something he'll be working on for a couple of years. He didn't anticipate publishing the book till 1966 at the earliest, as I recall. And the question was to what extent we should make materials available to him, or to what extent would he share with us what he had learned in his investigations to date. So I had a good meeting with Mr. Manchester, then brought him over to meet with Lee Rankin, where we covered some of the same material, and someone had suggested that maybe he would want to review our investigative reports, and he told us he had no interest in doing that. I think he looked forward to our completion of the task, and he wanted to keep generally apprised of who we were talking to, what we were doing, and I did meet or talk to him on a couple of further occasions, but our operation was completed in September of 1964, and he was deep into his work for the next a year and a half or so.
Subsequent testimony of Mrs. Kennedy becomes a great matter of concern, which is covered in later entries. But in this initial conversation with Mr. Manchester, did you get a pretty good sense that Mrs. Kennedy didn't really have much that she'd be able to offer?
Well, that's right, and I think it would be useful to read that section on page 2. He and I, quote, discussed the problem of taking the testimony of Mrs. Kennedy. He said that she had talked to him at great length about the assassination and the subsequent events and was on tape regarding these matters. Apparently, she made a variety of very frank comments about people in the course of her recollections. Mr. Manchester said that she had expressed great interest in the newspaper reports to the effect that she was going to be called before the commission. I told him precisely what the situation was on this matter. He indicated that she really had very little to contribute. He states that she was looking away from the president at the time of the first shot and turned only when she heard the governor's squeal. According to Mr. Manchester, she then turned and saw the president get hit in the head and fall over onto her. She does not remember climbing out of the car into the back. End of quote. And with respect to his timetable, Manchester said that he could not publish his work until 5 years from the date of the assassination unless Mrs. Kennedy and she alone allowed him to publish at an earlier date.
Now, considering how controversial it became whether or not to ask Mrs. Kennedy to testify, was there ever any discussion or consideration about asking for permission to get the Manchester tapes?
No, there was no. That's an interesting point. It was made pretty clear that the tapes were not going to be made available to the commission, and in fact, those are the tapes that are locked up for 100 years, I guess, from the date of their taking. But obviously, by implication, the tapes included a lot of frank comments about the president, and it was at a time in her life where I'm sure she had a lot of very strong emotions about that event. So there never was any question about the need to question her. As we developed later on, it was a question of how to elicit from her what the information she had, and how could one do so in as short a time as possible, so as to spare her the need to recapitulate some of the emotional event that she was being asked to talk about.
If Manchester had wanted to see some of the materials before they were published, would that have presented a problem?
Well, probably, but I think we could have probably solved it if he'd wanted to hear about any specific issue. I'm sure that I could have helped in that regard, and there might be certain restrictions on what he uses. But he evidenced. I didn't recall that. In fact, he had that undertaking of not to publish for 5 years unless she agreed to an earlier date. And as you know, the early publication was delayed because of a controversy in which the former Attorney General Bob Kennedy apparently strenuously argued against including some material in Manchester's book, and I don't know any of the details about exactly what concerned him the most. I presume it had to relate to Mrs. Kennedy.
There's a book written about the making of Death of a President, and Death of a President is now considered, even though there are factual inaccuracies in the book, it's considered to be a classic in the realm of assassination literature. So it's interesting that you had the chance to spend some time with Mr. Manchester. I wish I had the chance to meet him at some point, but that did not happen. Towards the end of this entry over on page 4, Mr. Rankin and I also discussed with Mr. Slauson the proposed letter from the Chief Justice to the Secretary of State regarding the request to the government of Cuba. Talk a little bit about that, because it reveals a little bit of the Chief Justice's attitudes towards Cuba, which informs what we talked about yesterday, this alleged meeting that he may or may not have approved with Castro aboard the yacht.
Well, this is the request, I believe, to try to obtain the reports from the Cuban agency that had to deal with the request for a transit visa sought by Oswald and communicated from the consulate in Mexico City. And I think there was some reticence on the Chief Justice's part to this, and Rankin undertook to take it to the Chief justice as soon as possible. My recollection is we went forward on this matter and without the Chief Justice's initial approval, but that we thought it was necessary to do. I may have the wrong report, but I know we did. David took the initiative, and I supported him in trying to get this processed because it seemed sort of a routine request, and that it would be helpful if we got some response from the Cubans. And we had some confidence that the CIA might be able to provide its judgment as to whether it was an authentic response or whether it was deficient in some respect that they could identify.
We'll move on to the next entry.